Hey, my name is Tex. Thank you for coming by again today. If you like what you're hearing, or if it pertains to you and you want to send to somebody else, please by all means do, or hit that subscribe button. Glad that you came back. Today, I'd like to talk about grief, complicated grief, and chronic grief. Distinguish between them and give you some ideas about grief in general. The first thing I'd like to do is distinguish what grief can be about. Every person, again, is unique, and the obstacles that you get in life and how you overcome them are strictly a matter of you, your character, your circumstances. No two people are exactly alike. A lot of times people will grieve a loss, and the loss isn't that someone passed. It could be a job, or it could be an ability. Surely you can understand how somebody would grieve not being able to walk, or loss of a hand. Sometimes when people have a stroke, one of the things is the idea that they've lost that ability to function independently. I know a lot of people, as they get older, sometimes there's that worry about loss of independence, and they grieve not being able to do the things that they once did. There's also grief surrounding the loss of a pet for some people, because that pet represents to them their connection to this world. That was their joy in their life, their reason for getting up in the morning and getting out and going for a walk, coming home in the evenings and having, their pet look for them, the enjoyment that you get out of an animal. It also has a connection to other kinds of losses through life, separation, divorces. A lot of times children will grieve when the parents get separated. Speaking of children, I always explain to people that you haven't done your job as a parent until you've gotten them a plant, a goldfish, a hamster, and a cat or a dog. And you get them in that order, and you do it for a reason. Because over time, as a kid, we learn to experience loss if it's in our life. And hopefully, we have our parents and family and friends there to help us get through the loss and show us how to deal with grief, so that we basically are able to handle heavier, more serious grief as life goes on. Because as you get older, those things will happen. As my grandma always said, if you live long enough, you'll get old. And odds are, if you live long enough, you're definitely going to die. So, death is a part of life, it's part of the cycle. It doesn't mean that you have to be either totally devastated or ignore it altogether. You find a comfortable in between where you learn to handle it, you acknowledge the loss, and hopefully you move on. The part of grief where you don't move on is where we get into chronic or complicated. And they're two different things. Chronic grief is when you have grief that lasts a little longer than is a norm for you. Now, the norm for you is different, because depending on your culture, depending on how your family handles it, some people are able to deal with grief and move on maybe in 2 weeks, 2 months. Some people, it takes 2 years. Some cultures have specifics of you will grieve for 1 year, and you wear certain clothes and you do certain things. It's all part of the grieving process. Sometimes, and I know from where I come from down south, a lot of times there's a party afterwards that is literally that, a celebration of life. I've seen up here people have the celebration of life, and people will get up and talk and say good things about the person, how they was affected by them, and how they'll miss them. Some places down south, I know it turns into an all-night party where people are able to go through the whole grieving process, and it, at the same time celebrate while they also acknowledge their loss. And it becomes a mixture of emotions that allows people to express it all, and hopefully sometimes move through it. Again, every culture is different, every family is different. Now, the part about where it goes from being grief to chronic grief is when the grief never seems to go away. In other words, when I give people an explanation of how depression works, and I say, this is, say, your normal you as you go through, it's a line. And in life, certain things will happen, and you will dip below your normal line of happiness or well being, and you will be sad, and you will feel this loss, and you go down. And hopefully, eventually, you do start coming back up, and it may be some ripples. You may come up and then drop down again. Those drops might be significant to time frames, because a lot of times, anniversaries or events that normally you associate with that person that you lost, like Christmas or the holidays. Um, there are certain things that will remind you. Sometimes it can come on suddenly. You're moving things around in the house and you open up an old box that has a lot of memorabilia from that person's life, and you sit down and it kind of hits you like a wave, and you have a little mini grief again. Again, these are all acceptable. It's all your own way of dealing with things. It's when it gets to be so long term that you're not able to function and get through it, that chronic, just the same ways when you see the doctor and they say you have acute pain versus chronic. Acute, you identify it's there. You might be able to take some medication or do some physical therapy to get through it. Chronic pain is long after the event that caused it, and the things that probably you work through have gone by, and you're still feeling that long-term pain, or in this case that long-term loss. So it doesn't seem to go away, and it just sort of drags on. Complicated grief is when some people don't even acknowledge the loss. In other words, they keep going on as if nothing happened. You've heard stories about people who got fired from a job, but yet every day they keep showing back up where they used to work at. Or in the case of someone who's lost someone significant to them, they keep the room as if the person is still alive. They don't do anything to change that, and they keep grieving and going through the process of grief without actually acknowledging the loss. And it becomes a situation where it becomes more damaging to their overall stability than helping them, because if they could acknowledge it and work through it, then they could move on. There's also things that you can do specific to helping you work through grief. Again, everyone's different. I do recommend counseling if you feel that the grief has become long term or is very upsetting or unmanageable. Counseling comes in different forms. There's groups, there's also individual counseling. I know here in Annapolis, they have a couple of organizations that are specific to grief and loss. Sometimes you can be prepared and already know that you want to talk to them because the person went through a long stage of hospice. Uh, so, how you handle it and how you go about it, as long as you're going about it, is the main point. Working on something. There's a lot of literature you can read. You can do Kubler Ross's stuff. You can find it online, Stages of Grief. There are books about grief and loss. Sometimes bibliotherapy or reading about things to do therapy is very helpful for some people. There's lots of videos on YouTube. I advise you to take a look at a few of them and see if they help. Sometimes, if you have friends, church, civic organization, anything you can to just drum up that social support network to help you get through it is what I advise. And above all, when other people are going through grief, one of the things that I picked up on one of my trainings, which was real quick, was is be careful to not say the things that everyone always says. If someone is grieving, allow them to grieve, allow them to feel their grief. Don't feel that you need to shut them down, that you need to, oh, quit crying. Here's some tissue. Stop. This is going to be okay. Telling kids, that's enough crying. Stop. Let the person grieve. And a lot of times, what we think is helpful to us, it may be helpful because in our belief system, we believe this is what we want to hear. But certain phrases like telling someone, that, oh, they're better off or they went to a better place. Be careful when you say those things because sometimes it hurts the person more than it helps. So I always tell people if you want to say something, just tell someone, I'm here. I'll listen. I can talk. You don't have to give them advice. You don't have to tell them what to do. If they ask for something, that's great. But if they're not asking, let them acknowledge their grief and their loss and work through it. Be there for them, be supportive. And then again, like I said, if they ask you for help, seek it. And if the help that they need is more than you know how to do, don't be afraid to say, this is over my head, but together we'll find someone who can get you the answer, can help you get through it. Okay. So I hope y'all have a great day. And next time I talk to you, I promise I will shift over into some things that I was asked about personality disorders, which is my specialty. I work in that a lot. I do a lot of it during the day with a lot of my clients. And the questions that came up was one that someone said they didn't see a lot on the internet about, which was dependent personality disorder. So I will specifically try to do something about that next time. Y'all have a great day. And again, thank you so much for coming by.